I was late closing the cafe because of the rain, the kind that turns city streets into mirrors and keeps regulars lingering over refills they never intend to finish. By the time I killed the neon sign and stepped into the alley out back, the storm had calmed to a slick shimmer, a breath on wet brick. I heard it before I saw it, a thin rasp of breath, the scraped whine of claws against a dumpster's rusted edge. I told myself to keep walking. Instead, I followed the sound. He was just a shadow at first, a bundled shiver wedged between stacked milk crates and a torn trash bag. When my eyes adjusted, I saw a dog's narrow face, soaked fur plastered to sharp bones. One ear stood ragged, the other folded like a broken wing. His tail thumped once when I crouched. Then he tucked it tight and watched me like I was both salvation and the last mistake he could afford to make. "Easy, buddy," I said without saying it, because I have this habit of talking to animals in my head. I slid my hand along the ground, palm up, fingers steady. No sudden movement. The city hummed behind us, tires whispering, a siren somewhere far, the fizzle of rain dripping from a fire escape. The dog sniffed and flinched when thunder rolled above the roofs. Under the wet streetlight, his eyes caught a glint of amber. Not feral, frightened. My tote bag still held a heel of sourdough and a small container of roasted chicken. I had planned to eat standing over my sink. I tore the bread into soft coins and placed one near his paws. He stared at the offering, then at me, then leaned forward just far enough to take it. He chewed like someone who had been punished for eating too fast. I gave him another, then a flake of chicken. His whole body shivered when the meat touched his tongue. That decided things. I eased closer until my knees hit the damp concrete. The dog lowered his head and I saw the collar, not a length of shoelace or a chain, but a real leather collar, dark and smooth even beneath the rain. No tag, just a tiny embossed emblem near the buckle, a circle with a stylized crown inside. I'd never seen a brand like it. I spoke softly without sound, like I always do, and offered the last of the chicken from my open palm. He licked my fingers. Some creatures sign contracts with paper. Animals sign them with trust. Okay, I thought. We're doing this. I slid the tote strap from my shoulder and made a sling. When I moved the collar to check for injuries, he tensed, but he didn't snap. There was a cut along his flank, as if he had slid under a fence and caught on wire. Not deep, but dirty. I could clean it at my apartment. The cafe's lock clicked behind me, like a door closing on a smaller life. The dog weighed more than he looked. He tried to walk, but his back leg dragged for 2 steps before it found rhythm again. I kept one hand on his shoulder and we shuffled toward the street. We made an odd pair reflected in the puddles, me in a too big gray cardigan and soaked sneakers, him ragged and regal at once. A cab slowed, considered us, then looked away like guilt in a rearview mirror. Typical. I live 3 blocks from the cafe, second floor of a brick building with a fading mural of swallows and an old bakery sign ghosted on the wall. My landlord hates animals. He writes notices in capital letters taped where everyone can see. No pets, no exceptions. Which is why I climbed the back stairs, with the dog pressed close, praying the motion sensor light would stay broken. It flickered twice and then died with a sigh, like it was on my side. Inside, my studio felt even smaller than usual. 1 room, 1 window, a galley kitchen, a bathroom so narrow you have to turn sideways to dry off. But the heat works, and the floorboards are old wood that creaks like an old friend. I grabbed towels and a mixing bowl, filled it with warm water, and coaxed the dog onto an old quilt. He let me clean the cut, teeth set, eyes steady. He didn't whimper. He watched me like a soldier watches a medic. Under the grime, his coat was a deep brindle, the kind of color you only see when the light hits right. He had that greyhound meets shepherd build, fast and thoughtful. The leather collar was expensive. I told myself someone must be looking for him. I told myself I would call a shelter in the morning and post in neighborhood groups with a carefully cropped photo that hid my apartment. The truth was harsher. If I called the city shelter, a dog with an injury and a past might not get a second chance. I made him a nest beside my bed with 2 folded blankets and an old sweater I never wore. He circled once, twice, like he was measuring the idea of safety, then curled with a sigh that emptied the room of its storm noise. I sat on the floor and leaned against the mattress. The clock blinked 12:14. I should have been exhausted, but the alley and the strange emblem on the collar looped through my head. Around 2 in the morning, the building shifted in its sleep. A car door closed outside, footsteps climbed the front stairs, paused in the hall, and kept going. City life teaches you to catalog sounds without thinking. This one snagged on something inside me. I stood and padded to the window, pulling the curtain 2 fingers' width. A black sedan idled at the curb. Not rideshare, not a neighbor. Engine running, lights low, windows dark. The driver waited. The dog lifted his head before I moved, ears pricking to a frequency older than alarms. He stood, tested his back leg, and pressed his shoulder against my knee as if to say, "We are not alone." I told myself the sedan at the curb was rideshare overflow waiting out the rain. Then its lights went dark and the street settled into that held-breath quiet. Cities get at 2 a.m. I kept the curtain cracked and watched the driver step out with an umbrella and a long coat that shed the weather like it had been trained. He spoke into a phone and nodded once. 2 other figures appeared at the end of the block, silhouettes that had learned to become human only when necessary. They did not linger near the umbrella. They watched. I backed away from the window and sat beside the dog. My apartment smelled like rain, coffee grounds, and the lemon soap I used on his cut. Ordinary air. I breathed in 4s and 6s, the way my therapist taught me after my mother died, and felt my pulse drop from hummingbird to nervous sparrow. The dog matched me with a long exhale and rested his chin on my shin. 10 minutes. 15. The sedan idled without impatience. Finally, the driver's door opened again and a different man climbed out. No umbrella, no coat. Rain pinned silver to his dark hair and jacket, and he ignored it. He moved with the kind of economy I have only seen in trauma surgeons and men who decide how nights end. He reached my building stoop, looked up once like a person confirming a calculation, and pressed the bell. 3 choices presented themselves like cheap prizes. Pretend not to be home and hope he left. Call the police and invite more unknowns. Or meet inevitability halfway. I ruled out the second option fast. I had a nameless caller and an injured dog. I pictured forms and questions and an animal control van I could not allow. Ignoring the bell would change nothing. I pulled on dry jeans, slipped my phone in my pocket, pointed the dog to his blanket, and whispered, "Stay." He did not know the word, but he knew the shape of it and sat with his eyes fixed on the door. The hallway light flickered as I went down. Old photos in crooked frames watched me like bored strangers. The front door stuck, then gave. Rain threaded silver through the air. The man on the stoop had his back to the street the way a sentinel does when he trusts his perimeter. Up close, he could have been 30 or 40, the ageless bracket men earn by sleeping less than they should. He said my name like he had confirmed it twice. I did not ask how he knew it. That is a rule you learn in cities. Do not donate facts. I asked if I could help him. He smiled the way people smile at a child answering a toy phone. His eyes were that uncertain city color between gray and light brown, tidewater under cloud. "You found something tonight," he said without making it a question. I felt the weight of the collar's emblem as if it sat burning in my pocket. It lay drying on my kitchen counter instead. Whatever crossed my face, he saw it. His smile thinned into relief with edges. "He belongs to a friend," he said, using the word the way bankers use the phrase close partner. "We have been looking for him since afternoon." There was an argument, a gate open, an instinct indulged. He does poorly without boundaries, and so do the men who care about him. May I come up? Every sensible cell voted no. But certainty wears people down. Also, if force had been the plan, it would already be over. I weighed the variables, counted the shadows, and put a 5-minute limit on the risk. "Only you," I said. He nodded once and spoke into the rain. The other silhouettes dissolved back toward the car, like ink returned to a line. We climbed the stairs with the polite distance of strangers pretending this was normal. The dog heard us before the lock turned. He stood in the middle of the room with his head high and ears forward, wearing his blanket nest like a small cape. When he saw the man, something in him loosened and then braced again, the way devotion remembers discipline. The man knelt without minding the wet he brought and offered a hand, palm down. The dog crossed the space, sniffed, and pressed his face hard into the man's wrist. The breath the man let out could have been prayer in another grammar. He checked the bandage with surprising competence and murmured a little Italian my grandmother would have recognized. Gratitude sat in the room without anyone saying it. I asked about the emblem, a circle with a small crown. He glanced at it, then at me. "It means he is claimed," he said. "Not the kind of claim that can be purchased retail." That was when the shape of the night changed for me. The friend was not a neighbor with a nice fence. He was the kind of man whose fences are made of other men. The room felt an inch shorter. My heartbeat had announcements. "There is a custom," the man said, and I already understood it was less custom than rule. "The owner wishes to thank you in person. It will be brief. He will be respectful. He will also be insistent." "When?" I asked. "Now," he said, and looked toward the window where the sedan waited like punctuation. "I told the dog he could come." The man gave the smallest nod, like I had passed a test I did not know was being administered. He lifted the collar, weighed it in his hand, and left it on the counter the way a ring is left before surgery. Then he held my door, and the stairwell swallowed us back into the rain. The street seemed narrower than it had an hour earlier. The sedan door opened as we approached. Inside smelled like leather and winter, and something expensive I could not name. The dog jumped up first and settled on the floor, one paw touching my shoe like an oath. The man took the seat opposite and tapped twice on the glass. The city fell away like a curtain going up. We traveled 6 blocks east and 3 north, then into a lane I had passed 100 times without noticing. A gate rolled open at our approach. The building beyond it hid in plain sight, brick and steel with no sign, windows lit soft as if by intention rather than bulbs. The sedan stopped beneath an overhang. The door opened to a hallway that smelled like citrus and quiet. "He is through here," the man said. "You may keep the dog with you." I wanted to ask a dozen questions, and none at all. We followed the sound of low voices and clinking glass to a room dressed in dark wood and soft light. A man stood with his back to us, shoulders straight, one hand resting on the back of a chair the way some people rest a palm on the shoulder of someone they love. He did not turn immediately. The dog made a sound I had not heard from him, a small note that contained history and apology. The man pivoted then, and the room recalibrated around his decision to face us. He was beautiful the way storms are when you are inside a safe house. Not delicate, precise. His eyes were the same uncertain city color as the other man's, only colder or more honest. He looked at the dog first, which told me the important thing. Then he looked at me, which told me the rest. He didn't speak right away, and in that silence I became aware of every clock tick, every breath between us. The dog leaned against my leg as if to remind me who had started this. The man's gaze was steady but not cruel, assessing in the way of someone used to reading motives as quickly as pulse. "You took care of him," he said at last, his voice low enough to make the air hum. I nodded because words felt too formal for the moment. "His name is Nero. He does not trust easily." I said he had trusted me quickly enough for chicken scraps and a dry blanket. That earned me the ghost of a smile, quick and almost private, as though he hadn't expected humor here. He came closer, not threatening, just gravity in motion. Water darkened the cuffs of his shirt where the rain had soaked through. May I see where he was hurt? I showed him, pointing to the clean bandage at Nero's flank. He crouched, careful, and the dog accepted his touch without protest. I had seen gentleness before in surgeons and children, never in someone whose presence carried the weight of command. "You cleaned it well." Thank you, he said. Simple words, but delivered with precision, like a signature at the end of a treaty. When he stood again, I noticed the ring on his right hand, gold brushed to dullness, engraved with that same crown emblem. The circle from the collar was his crest, not a brand, but a mark of ownership older than I cared to guess. You work nearby, he said, and I told him about the cafe, about closing late because of rain. He listened with the kind of patience that made every detail sound like evidence. When I ran out of sentences, he poured a small glass of something amber from the decanter and placed it on the table between us. For the chill, he said. I didn't drink it, just held it for warmth. He asked what made me stop for a stray in an alley. The question wasn't accusation, just curiosity with steel beneath it. I told him the truth, that I couldn't walk away from things that needed help, that maybe it was a flaw, that maybe it wasn't. He studied me long enough for my reflection to settle in his eyes. Then he nodded once, decision made. You will not be punished for kindness. Some might have mistaken it for mercy. I heard it as a statement of policy. He motioned toward the sideboard, and one of the silent men, who had been pretending to be furniture, stepped forward with a towel and a dry coat. Please, he said, let us take you home. Nero will go with you tonight. He does not like to be separated after a fright. I hesitated. Taking gifts from men like him was currency with invisible exchange rates. But Nero had already pressed his head against my knee again, and I didn't have the heart or the logic to refuse. In the car, the world outside was still dripping from the storm. The driver took a different route back, all clean asphalt and dark glass facades. The man sat beside me now, his profile lit by the dash glow, and spoke almost idly. You should know his disappearance caused concern. Some people might have misunderstood his value. I asked what he meant. He glanced at me, then back at the road ahead. Nero carries messages, not in his mouth, but in the technology woven into his collar. Tracking, encryption, things that make enemies impatient. My stomach tightened. So the emblem hadn't just been decorative. That meant the people who had been watching the street might not all have been his. Does that mean someone else was following me? I asked. It means you were fortunate my men arrived first, he said. Fortune had a strange way of choosing its targets. I looked down at Nero, who had stretched out across the seat like travel was his normal state. He was asleep again, trusting me to guard him from nightmares that now belonged to both of us. The car stopped outside my building. The man turned toward me, expression unreadable. My name is Luca, he said, and the way he said it filled the space with quiet authority. If anyone comes asking about Nero, you will call this number. He handed me a card heavier than paper should be. No logo, no address, just digits pressed into the surface. I promised I would. He studied my face, searching for something he didn't find or didn't want to name. Then he opened the door himself and let the rain in again. By the time I turned to thank him, the car was already gone, swallowed by the city's slow heartbeat. Upstairs, my apartment felt smaller, safer, lonelier. I hung the card by a magnet on the fridge where I could pretend it was a grocery list. Nero settled back onto his blanket and sighed like a pensioner after a long shift. I poured myself water, not whiskey, and tried to ignore the way my hands shook. I told myself tomorrow would reset things, posters on lampposts, stories to friends about an adventure that ended fine. But when I looked at the collar still drying on the counter, the crown caught the light, and I knew that nothing about tonight was finished. At dawn, I woke to a knock. 3 quick raps, deliberate, not the hesitant rhythm of neighbors. Nero lifted his head, ears pricked. No growl this time, just alertness. I checked the peephole. A woman stood there, early 30s maybe, wearing a coat too fine for the building. She held a folded umbrella and an expression that said she wasn't here for coffee. I opened the door halfway. Miss Rivera, she said, pronouncing my name exactly right. Mr. Luca asked me to deliver this. She offered a small package wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax stamped with that crown. Inside was a note, handwritten, precise. For the one who mends what others break. Beneath it, a new collar. this one silver-threaded, its emblem smaller. I traced the pattern with my thumb. Nero wagged his tail once as if approving. The woman waited until I met her eyes. "He values loyalty," she said quietly. "Few understand that it runs both ways." Then she turned and left before I could ask her name. By afternoon, the story had already begun to twist itself into something mythic in my mind. A stranger with a crest. A dog that carried secrets. But truth has a habit of finding you before you can rewrite it. That evening, as I closed the cafe, 2 men walked in, ordering coffee they didn't touch. Their suits were too sharp, their watches too heavy. One placed a photo on the counter. Me, rain-soaked, leading Nero through the alley. The other asked where the dog was now. I did not look at the photo, because looking would concede ground I had not agreed to surrender. I looked at their untouched cups and asked whether they wanted lids. The tall one smiled, without his eyes, and said the dog belonged to an elderly aunt who was heartbroken. The line was too polished to be true. I told them I hoped she felt better and slid the photo back across the counter. They did not touch it. The shorter one left a flimsy card with a number and no name. I said the kitchen was closing and wished them a quiet night, the kind that leaves nothing behind but dishes. Their smiles stayed where they were, and never reached their faces. They did not argue. They stood a moment longer and left with the bell making its small apology. I watched them turn the corner, then called the number Luca had given me. A calm voice answered with my name. I described the suits, the chipped bezel, the shoes too new for rain, the way one man kept adjusting his collar. "Thank you," the voice said. "Lock up, go home, keep the dog inside." I cleaned, stacked chairs, and checked every lock twice. The alley was a damp throat again. I took the long way home, doubling back by the bodega and the laundromat. Nero paused and looked behind us the way creatures do when memory is older than reason. No footsteps. No voices. Still, I felt the idea of eyes. The sensor light at my building worked and poured pale gold over the steps. It made me visible, and it made the shadows honest. Inside, I fed Nero and checked the bandage. Healing clean. He leaned into my hand and exhaled. I stood at the window with the curtain raised 2 fingers and watched the block until the city put on its thin sleep. When I slept, it was the shallow kind. Morning arrived with the knock I recognized. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. I opened on the chain. Luca stood in the hall with rain on his shoulders and a paper cup that smelled like coffee I never buy. He did not look past me. He asked if I could walk. We went to the sidewalk where the sky was slate and the gutters glittered. He handed me the coffee. 2 croissants. Nero pranced like pastry was a treaty. Luca walked at a pace that implied he could lengthen it at will, but chose not to. His men were nowhere visible, and everywhere implied. He told me the 2 men were not his. He told me they had waited across from the cafe and that patience travels with cameras. He wanted to move me for a few days. He called it precaution. I told him I had shifts and a landlord who measures mercy in receipts. He agreed that lives do not pause, and then pointed out that lives can end. He did not say it like a threat. Nero pressed his nose into my palm. I said I would come if Nero came, and if I could lock my door and leave a note for my neighbor to water the plant that forgives me. Luca said that was arranged. Back upstairs, I collected the light carry of a life. Toothbrush, 2 shirts, my mother's sweater, jeans that forgive, a paperback with a broken spine, and the tin that holds her recipes. Luca waited by the door with the stillness of someone trained to conserve motion. He did not look at the crowded bookcase or the jar of screws I keep for reasons I never remember. We left by the back stairs. The sedan waited, but the route changed. We skirted the river and the high bridge, slid under an elevated line, and stopped at a wall the color of weather. A gate rolled open. Inside stood a building that did not brag. Glass and quiet concrete. A lobby scented like time. An elevator without visible buttons. A corridor. The apartment was exact rather than grand. White walls, pale wood, a window that made the city look curated. The guest room held a bed like a held breath, and a closet of matching hangers. Nero mapped the space and chose a spot where air braided. Luca showed me the kitchen, the whispering machine, the first aid kit with calm labels. Then he told me what mattered more than sheets. The men with the photo served a rival who collects people through gratitude and fear. A debt opens the door. Fear keeps it wedged. They had my name, and a grainy image, and a guess. They would have asked nicely until they did not. If I had not called, I asked. They would have kept asking, he said. We set rules. I would not open the door except to faces I already knew. My number would stay the same, but every call would bounce through a filter I could not see. Nero would wear the new collar, silver threaded with circuits disguised as ornament. If I left the apartment, someone would be 2 paces back, not to crowd, but to intercept. I asked how many people had been assigned to a woman with a cafe and a plant. Enough, Luca said. I asked why all this for a dog. He looked at Nero, and then at me. Some things are leverage, he said. Some things are family. By afternoon, the apartment felt like a waiting room between storms. I wrote my manager about a family emergency and scheduled the message. Luca made calls in a language that belongs to sunlight on slate. I brewed gentle coffee. Nero slept. The sun moved across the window. At evening, Luca returned. He said the men from the cafe had been redirected. He did not offer details, and I did not ask. Then he said he wanted to show me where Nero had run, not as punishment, but as context. I said I would go if we could come back here afterward. He agreed and picked up a leash I had never needed to clip. Tonight. We drove without sirens through a city that kept its secrets beneath well-lit streets. The route angled west, then north, then down through warehouses fading into dusk. Nero watched like a passenger who understood maps by scent. Luca spoke once to confirm a gate code. I watched his profile and the way quiet gathered around him like a coat. The place we stopped looked like a disused freight terminal. Then the lights came alive. A sliding door lifted with the hush of money well spent, and inside was not a warehouse but a training ground polished to a whisper. Turf trimmed to perfection. Obstacles arranged like a language. A glass wall with a room beyond where silhouettes moved with stillness. This is where Nero learns to find and to carry and to come home, he said. He did not say the words military or encryption. He did not have to. A woman stepped from behind the glass, hair clipped short, sleeves rolled, a control band around her wrist. Nero saw her and his tail wrote his history across the air. She held her palm up, fingers spread, and Nero sat, held, then flew at her when she clicked a tiny signal. She laughed, and the room softened. You ran, pirate, she said, and Nero ducked his head, happy in apology. Luca introduced her as Sarah. She shook my hand with the grip of someone who knows which bones matter. Thank you for lending him courage when he forgot his, she said. Then she set up a short run of platforms and tunnels. Watch, Luca said. What I watched was a conversation in motion. Sarah's hand barely flicked. Nero pivoted. Her shoulder tilted. He slowed. She glanced. He searched, nose painting lines that turned into meaning. He found a metal cylinder in a green box that matched 2 other green boxes and returned without clenching his jaw. Sarah praised in 3 languages, none of which required words. Sarah asked if I wanted to run a short line. I said yes. She placed the control band on my wrist until it sat snug. Hold your palm like this. He reads your silhouette more than your voice. Call him only when it matters. I called softly, and Nero came like a string had tugged his heart. We moved clumsy at first. My shoulder telegraphed what I intended to hide. My breath broke the rhythm. Sarah touched my elbow once, and my feet found forward. Nero adapted. He made me better without asking, and then made me look like I had always known what my hands were doing. When he returned the cylinder, his eyes held a joy so clean it made my throat ache. I gave him the praise he earned. "Good," I said, and meant it. When Sarah finished, she linked Nero's new collar to a console and showed me a screen rendered as loops and nodes. "Messages go one way only," she said, "and they go fast. If someone cuts the loop, the device sings, and then turns itself into quiet metal." I thought of the men at the cafe, and the photo, and my small apartment. I thought of the dog who had trusted me in an alley. We left by a back corridor that smelled like cedar and machine oil. Outside, night had settled. Luca walked beside me, not touching. "You taught him to return today," I said. "He taught himself and allowed us to believe," he replied. He glanced at my wrist where the control band had left a faint mark. "Some contact stays even after it is removed," he said. On the drive back, he told me a story that pretended to be about Nero, and was not. The first time a rival tried to steal something that carried our words, we lost a boy who loved dogs better than sleep. Sarah was his sister. She built the system that fails safe now. We do not forget debts, or the people who pay them. At the apartment, a man waited by the elevator. Upstairs, the door was ajar. Not wide, not careless. A line of light. The kind of mistake people make when they want you to think no one is inside. Luca's hand was on my shoulder before I realized I had stopped walking. He moved me behind him and tilted his head. The man in the jacket slid forward with a tool rolled in cloth. "Stay," Luca said. He pressed a knuckle against the door to widen the gap, and waited. "Silence is the loudest sound when it is wrong." He looked at me over his shoulder, a question I couldn't hear. I shook my head, and he entered first like water slipping into a glass. The apartment looked normal to an untrained glance. The duffel where I had left it. The book I had closed face down. The towel on the oven handle still crooked. But the plant had been moved half an inch so its leaves kissed the window. Luca moved through rooms, then stopped at the bedroom door and stepped aside so the man in the jacket could pass. What followed was brief and careful, efficient and quiet. When it was done, there was a new silence. Luca closed the door and walked back to me with apologies in his eyes, and none on his mouth. "You will stay elsewhere tonight," he said. The man in the jacket wiped the doorknob. Nero sat, watching, head tilted like he was reading a long sentence. I packed without looking at the bed. We took the stairs because elevators tell stories. On the street, the city breathed and pretended innocence. Luca's phone vibrated. He listened, then nodded. "They were patient," he said. "They had a key made from a photo. They wanted to leave a question in your pillowcase." He did not say what question. He did not need to. Nero pressed against my leg. I pressed my palm to his collar like a prayer. We relocated to a safe apartment above a shuttered bakery and beneath a lawyer's office that existed only on paper. The stairwell smelled faintly of flour and printer ink, forgiveness and forgery braided into one breath. Luca installed me like a system, not a guest, mapping sightlines, timing the elevator, choosing the chair that saw both doors and the window's reflection. Nero circled twice and took the rug with a sigh that sounded like relief crossing a border. I stood in the doorway longer than I meant to, pretending to decide where to put my bag while counting the ways this room could turn into an exit. Days lengthened when danger paced outside. I made lists to keep my head from rewriting the world in the worst possible ways. Replace bandages. Tell the landlord about a leak I invented. Ask Bay to cover my shift, and delete the draft that explains why. Feed the dog. Breathe. Luca read the lists without reading them, the way he read rooms. He offered tasks that pretended to be choices. "If you wish, teach Nero a new recall. If you prefer, we can cook. If you need it, sleep while I watch." He said it without warmth or cold, the even temperature of competence. We cooked because food is a treaty. I chopped onions with tears that belonged to the knife and to older things. He seared chicken in a pan that had never known seasoning and told me about a street in Naples where the bread tastes like bells. I told him about the cafe and my mother's recipe tin and how grief is a spice you do not taste until you stop eating. He listened like the pan listened to the flame. When we ate, Nero slept with his head on my foot, and the room felt like an answer we had not dared to ask. After washing the pan, Luca dried it as if it were a relic and set it down so gently the metal did not dare complain. Night returned with a body's memory of alarms. A truck braked far off, a soft click sounded near. Luca stood against the window, phone to his ear, voice a fine thread. When he finished, he sat the way people sit beside hospital beds, near but not touching. The rival's patience is thinning, he said, and patience, when it thins, cuts. He wanted to move first. What does moving first look like? I asked. It looks like asking you not to go back to the cafe tomorrow and asking you to trust that I will end what started in the alley. He did not say how. I asked if anyone else had been hurt because of Nero. A van tried to take Sarah 2 months ago, he said, and it did not work. He did not smile when he said it. Nero stirred and pressed his nose to my palm in his sleep, as if to sign his part of the contract. In the morning, we walked in a park that pretended to be countryside under the discipline of gardeners. A woman jogged past inside a neon hood. A child threw crumbs to pigeons who have learned about crumbs in hard schools. 2 men read separate newspapers on the same bench. Normal is an organ that regenerates if you do not look directly at it. I breathed and counted, and let my shoulders drop at the end of the 10th step, and again at the 100th. Luca joined us with coffee that did not splash. He watched Nero weave through damp grass and told me something I had not asked, that he once wanted to be an architect because buildings are promises you can live inside. I told him I had wanted to be a vet before money made that dream taller than I could reach, and that now I mend small things, stitches in aprons, cracked mugs, 1 dog. Small things hold the larger ones together, he said, and I believed him because he never wasted sentences. We returned by a different street. A delivery truck idled with its ramp down. A ladder leaned against a mural, and the painter filled a blue that looked like a new bruise. Nero halted and stared at a man smoking beside the truck. The smoker looked at me, then at Luca, then at Nero. He dropped the cigarette, crushed it, and vanished into the cab with a speed that belonged to a different career. The muralist watched the empty air. Luca's shoulders eased only when the truck pulled away. Back upstairs, the lawyer's office hummed through the ceiling, fans keeping machines from declaring themselves. Luca switched the lamps on, though daylight still held. Sit, he said, because he had a thing to say that required chairs. The rival had sent an invitation dressed as a truce. Refusing would sound like fear. Accepting would sound like arrogance. Both are dangerous when amplified. He planned to go. He wanted me not to. I am not a soldier, I said. You are not a pawn either, he answered. Then he asked for one promise, small and iron. If anything goes wrong, you take Nero to Sarah, and you do not come back for anything that can be replaced. He waited without blinking. I said yes, because there was nothing else to say that would not be a lie. He nodded and looked down at his hands, as if they had surprised him by asking. We ate early because hunger is a liar after dark. Sarah arrived with a case that looked like it held musical instruments and did not. She taught me a new signal for Nero, a flick of fingers that meant hide, a tap that meant be silent, a look that meant trust. She drew a small map on a napkin, a child's sketch with doors and arrows, and a star. If you must run, follow the star. It will not be obvious to anyone who has never had to run. Evening climbed the building, and the bakery exhaled one last warm breath. Luca put on a jacket that looked like an apology and a weight. He stood in the doorway with a stillness. I will remember when nothing else remains. Nero stood too, ears high. Luca set his hand on Nero's head and said, "Be good," and Nero licked his fingers like a seal. Then Luca looked at me as if memorizing a sketch he would finish later. Hair I had not combed, a sweater with a pulled thread, the tin of recipes near my bag. He left with 2 men and a car that showed no light. The hallway swallowed them. The clock said 10 minutes, and then 40, and then an hour. Sarah stayed, pretending to read, not pretending to listen. I made tea and did not drink it. At the hour-and-a-half mark, the phone I did not recognize vibrated on the table. Sarah answered and listened with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and said, "We are going to the Star now." She did not let me gather anything. She slung the case over her shoulder and opened a door I had not seen behind the hooks. A narrow stairwell led down into a rib cage of concrete. Nero went first, then Sarah, then me. We moved without sound because fear had eaten our noise. At the bottom, a hallway ran toward a light like morning. Sarah touched a sensor with her wrist and a gate unstitched itself. We stepped into a corridor I knew from no building. It felt like backstage in a theater, where the play is survival. A man met us and did not ask questions because the answers would tilt the floor. Sarah said Luca, and the man answered with a location, a word, a floor, a weight. We went. The air tasted like metal and citrus, clean in the way of places designed by people who fear dust. Nero paced at my knee, reading currents I could not. Somewhere above us, a city swallowed a secret and pretended it was just another Tuesday. I held the promise I had made, small and iron, and counted the doors between me and the life I had lived yesterday. We waited in a room with no corners, only soft curves that made it hard for the eye to settle. Someone designed it to calm the pulse of people who arrive from running. Sarah placed her case on the table and opened it with careful hands. Inside lay headsets, compact radios, adhesive patches, and something that looked like a pen, but hummed. She pressed one patch to Nero's collar and another beneath my sweater at the base of my neck. "It will guide you if you are separated," she said. It felt like a door breathed. A man in a charcoal suit stepped in and nodded to Sarah. He looked like the idea of a doctor, brisk competence without bedside lies. He asked me to hold out my hands. "Your tremor is normal," he said after a glance. "Yours is controlled." He meant Sarah. I almost laughed and could not find the place in my chest where laughter lived. Nero leaned on my thigh, and the tremor slowed as if he held the dial.
An hour is a forest when you have no map. We walked its paths in circles. I measured time by how often Sarah checked a wall display that showed no clock, only a line that brightened whenever a call came in, and dimmed when it ended. At last the line brightened and held steady. She listened, said yes, and then no, and then yes again, like someone braiding a rope. She hung up and nodded. "He is on his way." I did not ask if Luca was hurt. I did not want to make the word real until it had a chance to be wrong. The door opened and he stepped through with the careful grace of a man counting his bones. A cut traced his cheek like a mapmaker's line, and his shirt bore a rip that had opinions. His eyes found Nero first. The dog trotted forward and pressed against Luca's legs as if returning a piece the night had taken. Luca set his hand on Nero's head, then lifted his gaze to me. The quiet that moved between us as Sarah went to work with hands that did not ask permission. She cleaned the line on his cheek, checked his ribs with a practiced press, and muttered a curse in a language that warmed the air. "He is lucky," she said, which is what skilled people say when planning has tilted odds that did not want to tilt. Luca thanked her with a small nod, and then turned to me. "The truce was a stage," he said. "The rival arrived with cameras made of people. They wanted the story more than the outcome. When the story became done, I asked what changed the story. He looked at Nero again. We did, he said. We refused their grammar. Sarah added that the rival had tried a service door and found an argument instead of an opening. The argument had been persuasive. She did not elaborate, and I did not need memoirs tonight. The doctor returned with a tray and a device that read our pulses through the patches. He announced we should rest. Sarah agreed in a tone that brooked no empire. Nero finally slept, paws twitching as if running a younger road. Luca leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes in the way of men who nap like soldiers, upright and ready to stand inside a second. I watched the rise and fall of his breath until mine matched it, then drifted without trusting sleep enough to greet it. When I woke, a grey ribbon of morning had slipped under the door. Luca was still in the chair, head tipped, mouth relaxed in a way I doubted many had seen. Sarah sat cross-legged with her back to the wall, awake, reading an ugly paperback with the devotion of a monk. She glanced up and gave me a look that said you did well, and also this is not finished. I nodded back to say I knew both. We moved to the apartment above the bakery just after sunrise. The air smelled of dough again, and the lawyer's office knocked its quiet heartbeat through the vent. Luca walked slower now, but refused to sit until he had checked every hinge and blind. Then he did sit, finally, at the table where we had eaten, and reached for the recipe tin I had tucked into my bag. "May I?" he asked with his eyes. I slid it across. He opened it like a reliquary, and pulled out a card in my mother's hand. He smiled the small we baked because living insists on itself. He separated eggs with a competence that made me strangely proud of a man who commanded a city. I zested while he buttered the pan. The scent lifted the room. We spoke of nothing tactical. He asked what my mother taught me that was not a recipe. I said she taught me the difference between stubborn and steadfast, and that most days I pretend to pick the latter. He said his grandmother taught him that generosity is a security system. Then he slid the pan into the... When the cake cooled, we stood at the counter with forks and silence, and ate until sugar restored some of the cells fear had burned. It was not victory. It was a ceasefire between my nervous system and the day. Luca rinsed the forks and set them in the rack at perfect angles. Sarah arrived with news folded into a tone. The rival had retreated to write a different story. Our street would be quieter for a breath. A breath can be a city when you are tired. Luca turned to me with a new kind of quiet. "Come with me later," he said. "I want to show you the place where I remember why I build rules. It is not dramatic. It is a pier no one photographs. If danger allows," he added, "because truth should keep its shoes on." I said yes, without telling the part of me that still counted exits. Nero thumped his tail once, as if to second the motion, and then settled with a sigh that translated to, "For now, we are home." We left in the late afternoon, when the city wore that soft hour between commerce and dinner, when office towers loosened their ties, and corner stores counted the till. The car followed the river toward the docks, where cranes stood like long-legged birds waiting for a tide of steel. Nero kept his nose to the glass, breathing a catalogue of salt, diesel, wet rope, and the ghost of oranges from a splintered pallet. Luca drove himself, a man who trusts his own hands when the road can bend. The quiet between us felt chosen, the kind of silence that means more than a speech. The pier he chose was plain, planked with wood gone grey from weather and memory. A fence kept casual trespassers out, but Luca had a key and the kind of authority that persuades locks. We walked to the end where the river widened its shoulders before meeting the sea. Across the water, ship lights blinked like patient eyes. Luca leaned on the rail and let the wind unbutton tension down his spine. Nero lay at our feet, chin on paws, content to be a sentinel without fear. He said his grandfather taught him that banks hold rivers, and choices hold men steady in storms. He asked what I wanted when this storm finished. Not what I feared, not what I would accept, but what I wanted if wanting were allowed. The question startled me more than codes and the bright grammar of gunmetal. I said I wanted to lock my door without staging a rehearsal. I wanted to hand coffee across a counter to tired people and watch them stand a little straighter after the first sip. I wanted Nero to forget the sound of boots and remember the smell of bread. I wanted a life that did not require choosing between brave and alive. Then he told me what he wanted, which was not conquest and not surrender. He wanted quiet corridors where agreements could be made without cameras. He wanted men who chose their families without being drafted by hunger. He wanted to cook something simple and eat it while it was still warm. He wanted to know that when he sent people into the night, he was not sending them toward a name carved somewhere permanent. Nero thumped his tail like a signature. We walked the pier twice. On the third pass, Nero alerted at a gull dismantling a bread wrapper, all theatre and no threat. I scratched behind his ear and felt joy travel up my hand like a spark. On the way back to the car, Luca's phone pulsed and the air shifted. He read a message, typed 3 answers, then looked at me the way you look at a friend when you must carry a heavy thing past them without offering a handle. "We should stop at Sarah's," he said. "The rival is quieter than usual, which is the kind of quiet that plans. Sarah's place was part workshop, part monastery. Tools nested beside cables that pretended to be jewellery. A wall map hung without labels, only threads tracing the courses of birds that migrate by instinct and math." She placed a tiny device in my hand, shaped like a pebble smoothed by a patient river. "Clip it inside your shoe," she said. "If the floor ever lies, it will tell the truth." She fitted a fresh module to Nero's collar and made him sit until he remembered who he was. Then she hugged me, matter of fact, like a medic fastening a bandage that would not be needed unless it was. We returned to the safe apartment with the evening steeping into darker amber. I messaged Bea about the morning shift, offering 3 favours and a cake. She replied with a chain of hearts and a promise to break down my door with pastries if I didn't let her help. I translated that warmth into blankets and tea. Luca took a call on the balcony and came back with the look of a man who had moved 2 pieces and seen a better move appear 3 boards away. The rivals' collectors went home early, which made me feel better and worse at once. Night was generous for an hour, then changed its mind. The building's power hiccuped, recovered, then dimmed to a polite gloom. Nero stood, tail low, ears high, and faced the door. The pebble ticked once in my shoe, a heartbeat not mine. Luca killed the lamps and the room slid into shadow. He opened the drawer where he had left thin tools and set one by the jamb. "Sometimes quiet is an attack," he said, and a moment later the hallway light went out as if it had heard and agreed. Footsteps padded toward us with the caution of people who have practiced not being heard. Nero growled, short and old as instruction. I touched his collar and felt the module's faint hum, a small machine deciding how hard it would sing if asked. Luca gestured to the wall behind the coat hooks. Sarah's star door looked like paint, until he pressed a hidden latch. The panel breathed and swung. "Go," he said, and there was no command in it, only a compass. We entered the ribcage stair and the door whispered shut behind us. A dull thud answered in the apartment like a sentence cut off mid-plea. We moved down, then across, guided by small lights that glowed only when we were close. The pebble warmed once, a warning about a section of floor that had paid for itself the minute someone careless mapped it. Luca led without rushing. Nero stayed tight to my knee, the professional who knows that staying close is not fear but form. The corridor ended in a service bay, where a plain van waited with the patience of a good lie. We climbed in, doors closed, engine whispered, and the building exhaled behind us like a lung that had remembered how. We drove a long rectangle through streets I did not name. From the van I watched the city tilt and right itself like a ship learning the wind. Luca did not look back. He watched the mirror only to confirm absence. When we stopped, we were beneath a building that hummed like a held note. The garage door sank behind us, and the van surrendered its heat into concrete. We rode an elevator that recognized Luca and refused to see me at all. When the doors opened, Sarah waited with a small smile and a larger question. "Safe?" she asked. "For now," Luca answered. And I believed him because Nero shook himself once and lay down as if safety, at least for a breath, could be a flaw you recognize. Sarah ushered us into a suite that looked like a lab had made a pact with a sanctuary. Plants softened glass, cables hid inside wood, and the air held the quiet of work done well. She set a kettle on and handed me a towel, though I was not wet, the gesture landing where steadiness had cracked. Luca leaned against the counter, eyes unfocused in the way of someone running 2 calculations at once, one about the room and one about every room beyond it. He asked about the power cut without asking. Sarah said the rival had learned to borrow utilities and returned them with strings tied underneath. "We severed the strings," she added, and somewhere in the building a transformer hummed as if to confirm. Nero paced a small circle, then found a spot that let him keep all the doors in the corners of his eyes. I knelt, checked his bandage out of habit, and found it cleaner than my thoughts. The kettle clicked and steam rose. Sarah poured tea that tasted like citrus and iron, nerves and repair. We drank in silence for a minute that stretched and then settled, like fabric pulled tight and smoothed by a careful hand. Luca set his cup down and said we could not stay still for long. Stillness in this city is a signal flare. He outlined options in that even tone of his. Option 1. We disappear into the edges for a week, while he and his people finish a thing they had started the night we first walked down a ribcage stair. Option 2. We stand on a pier with lights and let the rival send photographers in suits to tell a story that ends in somebody's favour. Option 3. We write our own vocabulary and invite the rival to fail at translation. He looked to Sarah, and she lifted a shoulder in a small shrug that said she liked option 3 because it required both planning and art. "What is option 3? I asked, tasting the number like a new spice. "We invite them to a place that is not a place," Sarah said. We set the ground under their feet to the honest angle and asked them to walk. She meant a meeting where the exits were ours, the lights were ours, The history was ours. Luca added that the rival had pride that could be manoeuvred into picture frames. He would not say no to an invitation that allowed him to strut. Where does such a place exist? I asked. Sarah smiled toward the plants. Anywhere the lights answer to me, she said. Then she slid a blueprint across the counter, a drawing so clean it could have been a prayer. The location was a decommissioned gallery by the river, a white box with perfect sightlines and ducts like arteries. She marked vents and pillars, noted where sound pooled and where cameras could be led to read wrong. Nero nosed the edge of the paper, as if to suggest a path only dogs understand. We rehearsed, because rehearsals save lives. Sarah taught me where to stand to be nearly invisible and exactly heard. Luca practiced the conversation, the offer, the warning hidden in the offer, the reminder that families who keep dogs who carry messages know how to end feuds when debt tallies go red. He did not rehearse threat. He rehearsed certainty. That is more frightening when delivered by a man who cooks eggs carefully. Night fell like an agreement. In the morning, the bakery below our ghost apartment shivered awake, and we slept a few hours in the upstairs suite. I woke to the smell of frying dough and the soft drum of rain returning. Luca was already up, dressed in calm, putting his ring on as if it were a decision renewed. He handed me a small device no bigger than a thumb segment. If anything you do not expect happens, slide this. It will sound like a light breaking. The device weighed less than fear and more than comfort. Midday arrived, and with it a driver whose face I did not bother trying to remember, because the world works better that way. We reached the gallery through a service alley that looked like an afterthought. Inside, Sarah had arranged space like choreography. Chairs that did not look placed were perfectly placed. Lights that seemed casual were brilliant in a Spectrum camera's hate. A single table stood slightly off-centre, the way a memory sits when it is about to be rewritten. Luca tested the room with his eyes, then with his feet, then with his breath. He touched the back of one chair and left a finger's width of space before letting go, as if to tell the chair it had a choice today too. Nero ranged the perimeter once, twice, memorized the smells of paint and dust, and settled near a pillar where he could vanish and emerge by will. Sarah adjusted a cable as if tucking hair behind an ear. The rival arrived late enough to assert importance, and early enough to feign politeness. 3 men in tailored shadows and an entourage of looks. Their boss had the bland handsomeness of a news anchor who likes the sound of his name. He complimented the space and the light while scanning for control. He did not see where the light refused to flatter him. His gaze landed on Nero with a smirk that did not know dogs are fluent in contempt. Luca greeted him without warmth or ice, just the temperature required to preserve facts. They talked in the way of men who build temporary bridges while measuring the width of the river. Luca thanked him for returning power to our building at odd hours, and the rival thanked him for not turning the city into a theatre with bad seats. Luca mentioned family by saying the word work, and the rival mentioned rules by saying the word market. Sarah listened without being seen, her fingertips resting on a panel that looked decorative and was not. I stood where I had been told, a ghost who could become real if needed. At the pivot, Luca placed a small velvet pouch on the table, opened it, and rolled out a ring that matched his own crest in mirror. The rival's eyes flickered. The history in that metal went back to days when messages were carried by horses and men were measured by who they shielded. Luca said it belonged to a house that had chosen to dissolve rather than be corrupted. He said debts had been paid in full on a night long ago, and that tonight would not require new debt if the rival remembered why this city still allowed certain men to walk its better streets. The rival tried a smile that practiced itself often and succeeded rarely. He implied threats dressed as shrug. He spoke the word dog in a way I did not like. Nero lifted his head and watched him with the calm disdain of a judge. Sarah tapped a pattern against the underside of the panel, and somewhere a door locked with the soft sound of a wind decided. Luca's voice did not rise, but it deepened, and the room learned what it was like to be told the truth in a pitch that levelled furniture. He told the rival the game had ended 2 moves back. He explained simply that the collectors had been returned to their senders with notes pinned to their coats that read, "This is not how we do business." He mentioned, without elaboration, a transfer interrupted, a list of names now in kinder hands, and a safe passage back to a family that would teach different rules. The rival stood, sat, adjusted an invisible cuff, and made a decision that looked like grace but was mostly arithmetic. He agreed to quiet, to boundaries, to leaving dogs out of disputes that belonged to men. The meeting ended with no hands shaken and no cameras satisfied. The rival left with his entourage turning into rain. Sarah exhaled and stretched her fingers until they popped. Luca picked up the ring and put it back in the pouch, and then into his jacket, returning history to a pocket like an old coin. He looked at me with eyes that had climbed down from guard towers and found earth. We were done for now, not safe, finished with this chapter. After the rival left, the gallery felt larger, as if the walls had been holding their breath and finally exhaled. The lights softened from surgical to dusk. Sarah coiled cables. Nero trotted one last perimeter and pressed his weight against my hip, asking whether the storm had truly crossed the river or just changed jackets. Luca stood in the doorway and listened to the building like a doctor listens to lungs. He didn't smile, but some tension unhooked from his shoulders and went quiet. We drove back without urgency for the first time since the alley. The city had put its ordinary mask on again. A cyclist debated with a taxi, a teenager practiced kickflips, a florist hosed the sidewalk. At a red light, a woman in a yellow coat waved at Nero through the glass. He considered her, decided she was neither threat nor sausage, and blinked. Luca's hand rested open on the wheel, relaxed in a way I had not seen. He said nothing, and it was enough. At the apartment above the bakery, I set water to boil and placed the recipe tin on the counter like an altar. I wanted cinnamon and butter to overwrite the memory of power cuts and soft knocks. Sarah arrived with pears and a wedge of cheese. Victory requires fruit, she said, and the room agreed. Luca peeled pears with a pocket knife, delighted by the promotion. I made caramel the colour of old coins. We built a tart and ate standing up because ceremony felt impatient. After, Luca asked what happens for me now, not as a strategist, but as a person who might come to my cafe and order coffee because he likes the way I ask whether people want warm milk. I said I would open tomorrow if the street allowed it. He said he could stage theatre that made the street safe and invisible at once. I told him ordinary life is theatre enough if you light it kindly. He accepted that with a tilt of his head. Night came like a neighbour with a casserole. We slept without taking turns, and the morning was grey and forgiving. Nero judged the day acceptable and wagged once. I walked to the cafe with him trotting at my knee and a paper bag of pear tart. The bell rehearsed and then sang. B hugged, scolded, and declared me an advertisement for small miracles and poor decisions. We sliced the tart into unsteady wedges, and the line forgave me with the enthusiasm of people who understand mysteries. By noon, the street had learned us again. Construction resumed its argument with air. A violinist turned scales into weather on the corner. I made coffees the way people like to be listened to, and each cup felt like a stitch pulling fabric back together. A man in a navy jacket read by the window and left a tip in an alphabet I couldn't place. Luca didn't appear, which was both relief and a new ache. Nero slept behind the counter like a saint. Mid-afternoon opened a pause. I stepped into the alley where claws had scraped metal and thanked the geometry of chance. Milk crates dented dumpster, a shadow that had become a story. When I turned, Luca was at the mouth of the alley, a memory at the edge of a dream. No entourage, just the coat that makes him look like weather. He asked for a walk without asking. We took the long block past the hardware store with jars of screws, the bookshop where cats choose readers, the church that smells like beeswax. He didn't talk business. He asked about my mother's handwriting, whether the loop in her S had always been so certain. I asked about his grandmother's window, and whether the view had trained his patience. We traded small questions. At the park, a tennis ball presented itself from my pocket as if planted. Nero returned it with pride that made strangers smile. We sat on a newly painted bench and watched the river think. The quiet won't last forever, he said, and I said I knew. He intended to build a buffer thick enough for ordinary life to bloom inside. There is a room by my office where plants refuse to die, he added. I thought of you when I passed it. I said I had bought a plant for the apartment, leaves like stars, a clay pot that forgives. We agreed to call it Ordinary Miracle, because hope deserves a little drama. We closed early with a sign that read, "Thank you for your patience. See you at dawn." On the way home I bought the plant and carried it like a small planet. Luca met us at the door with a smile I refused to qualify. We settled the pot on the sill and argued briefly about which direction it would prefer. Nero approved from the rug with an authoritative thump. We ate leftover tartan cheese and watched a movie about loyalty. The lights flickered once and held. When the credits rolled, the city kept breathing like a thing that had decided to live with us instead of against us. I washed the pan. Luca dried it. Sarah texted a photo of the gull at the pier stealing a sandwich. Before sleep, Luca traced the skyline with a fingertip on glass, writing a promise he could read. "Some storms end," he said. "Others decide to rain elsewhere. Either way, we learn which roofs we can trust." Nero huffed in his sleep, satisfied with ceilings paid for in kindness. I tucked the recipe tin back into its place. The plant lifted 2 leaves toward the streetlight. I turned off the lamp and let the room remember how to be a room. Outside, tires whispered, a siren hesitated and relented, and somewhere a bakery proofed tomorrow's bread. For the first time since the alley, I believed the city might keep us without asking for a receipt. Morning returned with the sky rinsed clean, and the city wearing yesterday's rain as a shine. I opened the cafe at dawn, chalked the board with a shaky hand, then steadied it with coffee. Nero took his spot by the door like a doorman who expects belly rubs as currency. The first customers shuffled in with sleep still folding their faces, and the bell wrote its tidy music. I poured, listened, nodded, and let steam and small kindness stitch the room back to itself. Ordinary life resumed like a record finally sliding into the groove it was made for. Luca came late morning, unremarkable as a man buying a double espresso, remarkable to anyone who knows what gravity feels like when it walks into a room. He kept to the corner by the window and watched the street the way a captain watches a horizon. We spoke with glances and errands, a napkin refolded, a second shot drawn. B teased me after he left, asking whether double espressos tend to wear rings with crowns. I told her some stories are best saved for winter and a long cake. She laughed and declared that winter could come early if I brought the cake. By afternoon, the river wind pushed clouds inland, and the light turned generous. A delivery driver with a crooked cap slipped me a note from Sarah, a diagram of a star door upgraded to ignore new tricks. I pinned the paper inside the recipe tin, between cinnamon rolls and lemon bars, the way people pin medals where only their own hands will ever see them. Nero approved with a soft huff, and returned to watching pigeons misjudge courage on the curb. Trouble tested its boundaries, because that is what trouble does when it thinks no one is watching. A stranger paused too long by the window, tracing condensation with a finger that wrote questions. He left when Luca stepped out of a reflection behind him. Later, a van idled in the alley and drove off as soon as Sarah's car turned into the block, headlights low, engine thoughtful. The city took notes and decided to behave for now. I wiped counters with attention usually reserved for vows and let the day unwind without breaking. At close, I counted the till and set tomorrow's grinds. Nero danced his end-of-shift trot as if he drew power from routine. We walked home along the river, the water wearing pearls of late light. Luca met us at the corner where the florist ties extra ribbon to lonely bouquets. He carried nothing, which can be a kind of offering. We climbed the stairs to the apartment above the bakery, and the plant raised new leaves like a quiet cheer. We cooked because a day like this asks for closure you can taste. He seared salmon in a small pan. I crushed herbs, and Nero supervised with professional gravity. We ate at the table where maps and plans had lived, and let plates stand in for borders we no longer needed. Luca asked if I would ever leave the city. I said the city raised me and scolded me and taught me the price of mercy, and that I am slow to abandon teachers. Later we walked the pier again, stars leaking through a thin cloud skin, water dark and patient. Luca leaned on the rail and told me 3 things he had never said out loud, where the river could hear them. He wanted to grow old enough to be boring. He wanted to carry fewer names on ledger lines that hurt to read. He wanted to build a room with windows on 3 sides and teach roses to forgive the wind. I told him 3 in return. I wanted to keep a door unlocked for a dog who always comes back. I wanted to hand coffee across a counter to strangers who become less strange with each cup. I wanted a life that could be trusted to hold. We stood there a long time, saying little, trading quiet the way kids swap treasures behind a school wall. The city breathed with us, not louder or softer, just together. Nero pressed his head against my thigh, and the shape of the night settled into something I recognized as peace that does not apologize for being temporary. On the walk back, Luca asked whether Nero had chosen me or I had chosen him. I said yes. He smiled, real and brief and sharp with relief. At the door, he hesitated, then reached for the recipe tin and set it square, a small blessing disguised as tidying. I slept with the window cracked and woke before alarms. The plant cast star shadows on the sill. Nero sighed in his nest and dreamed of pigeons that refused to learn. I brewed the first pot and wrote a note for B that said we are open and left a slice of pear tart wrapped in parchment beside it. I pinned Sarah's star map a little higher in the tin and added a new card in my mother's hand, copied by mine, labelled Promise. Then I unlocked the door and let the morning in. The bells